Number 10. Jennifer San Marco, the postal worker's deadly return. Jennifer San Marco had worked for the United States Postal Service in Goleta, California, but by 2003, her behavior had become increasingly erratic and concerning to her colleagues and supervisors. Co-workers reported that she would make bizarre statements, exhibit paranoid behavior, and demonstrate an inability to maintain normal workplace relationships. Her mental state deteriorated to the point where Postal Service management recognized she could no longer safely perform her duties, and she was eventually removed from her position and placed on medical retirement. For 3 years after leaving her postal job, San Marco lived a transient existence, moving frequently and displaying signs of deepening psychological disturbance. She believed that co-workers had conspired against her, that she had been unjustly forced out of her position, and that those responsible needed to pay for what they had done to her career and her life. On January 30, 2006, San Marco drove to the mail processing plant in Goleta where she had once worked, carrying a 9mm handgun and harboring intentions of revenge against those she blamed for her downfall. Before arriving at the postal facility, she went to the Goleta condominium of her former neighbor, a woman who had once tried to help her, but with whom San Marco had developed a contentious relationship. She shot and killed the neighbor in cold blood, the first victim in what would become a multi-location massacre. San Marco then drove to the mail processing center, arriving during the night shift when she knew former colleagues would be working. She entered the facility through an employee entrance, moving through the building with deadly purpose as workers went about their duties sorting mail and processing packages. She opened fire on employees, shooting 6 postal workers and killing 5 of them as terrified survivors fled or hid among the mail sorting equipment and storage areas. The victims included Beverly Graham, a mail processing clerk who was shot multiple times, Nicola Grant, another processing clerk killed at her workstation, Guadalupe Swartz, a clerk who died trying to escape, Malika Higgins, a young employee who had no connection to San Marco's past grievances, and Zay Fairchild, a male handler who was shot during the rampage. One worker survived her gunshot wounds and provided crucial testimony about the attack. As police surrounded the building and began clearing sections of the facility, they found San Marco in a restroom where she had taken her own life with a single gunshot to the head, ending the massacre but leaving investigators and the community to grapple with the aftermath of workplace violence that had claimed 6 innocent lives. The investigation revealed that San Marco had exhibited clear signs of severe mental illness, including possible schizophrenia or delusional disorder, for years before the shooting. Mental health experts who reviewed her case noted that she had developed persecutory delusions focused specifically on her former workplace and co-workers, a dangerous fixation that ultimately manifested in lethal violence. The Postal Service faced scrutiny over whether adequate measures had been in place to monitor San Marco after her medical retirement, and whether warning signs of potential violence had been properly assessed and addressed. The case prompted discussions within the United States Postal Service and other large employers about protocols for managing employees with serious mental health issues, the importance of threat assessment teams, and the need for systems to track former employees who might pose ongoing risks. The phrase "going postal," which had unfortunately entered American vernacular after previous postal workplace shootings, was reinforced by this tragedy, though mental health advocates emphasized that the vast majority of people with mental illness are never violent and that the issue was inadequate mental health intervention rather than employment in any particular industry. The families of the victims filed wrongful death claims, arguing that the Postal Service should have done more to prevent San Marco from accessing the facility and that her known mental health history should have triggered additional security measures. The Goleta community, a relatively quiet coastal city near Santa Barbara, was devastated by the loss of these postal workers, many of whom were well known in the area and had served the community for years. Memorial services drew hundreds of mourners who struggled to understand how workplace grievances and untreated mental illness could result in such catastrophic violence. The surviving employee who was wounded in the attack faced a long recovery process, dealing with both physical injuries and severe psychological trauma from witnessing her co-workers murdered. The case remains one of the deadliest workplace shootings in California history and stands as a grim reminder of the intersection between mental health crisis, workplace conflict, and access to firearms. In the years since the shooting, the postal facility implemented enhanced security measures, including restricted access points, surveillance systems, and protocols for identifying and responding to potential threats from current or former employees, though the psychological scars left on surviving workers and the broader postal community in the region endured long after the physical security improvements were completed. Number 9. Omar Thornton, the discrimination claim and beer distributor massacre. Omar Thornton had worked as a driver for Hartford Distributors, a beer and alcohol distribution company in Manchester, Connecticut, for approximately 2 years when his employment came to an abrupt and disputed end on August 3, 2010. Company management called Thornton into a disciplinary meeting that morning, presenting him with surveillance video evidence that allegedly showed him stealing beer from the warehouse and selling it for personal profit. The company gave Thornton a choice that is common in employment termination situations where criminal activity is suspected but the employer prefers to avoid legal complications. He could resign immediately or be fired and potentially face criminal charges for theft. Thornton, who was one of the few black employees at the distribution center, had previously complained to coworkers and union representatives about what he described as a racist work environment, alleging that he had encountered racial slurs, discriminatory treatment, and racist graffiti in the facility's bathrooms. His complaints had not resulted in significant disciplinary action against other employees, and he felt that management had dismissed or minimized his concerns about the hostile work environment he claimed to experience daily. During the meeting where he was confronted with the theft allegations, Thornton signed resignation papers, and company officials believed the employment termination process had concluded without incident. However, Thornton had arrived at work that morning with a Ruger SR 99mm pistol and a Ruger P89 9mm pistol concealed on his person, suggesting that he had already decided how he would respond to whatever transpired during the meeting. After signing the resignation documents, Thornton pulled out his weapons and immediately opened fire on the company executives and human resources personnel who were in the meeting room with him. He shot and killed Brian Surigliano, the company's vice president of operations, and Louis Felder, another company official, at point-blank range as they sat across the table from him. Thornton then moved through the warehouse and office areas, hunting for other employees and managers, firing methodically at workers who had been going about their normal duties moments before. He killed Steve Hollander, a company executive, Craig Pepin, a union official who had been present at the disciplinary meeting, Victor James, a warehouse worker, Edwin Ruiz, a driver, and Tracy Merton, an office worker who was engaged to be married. 2 other employees were seriously wounded in the shooting but survived. As Thornton moved through the facility, terrified employees fled in all directions, hiding behind pallets of beer, crawling under trucks, and running out into the parking lot and surrounding industrial area. Some workers who managed to escape the building called 911, providing real-time information to dispatchers about the active shooter situation unfolding inside Hartford Distributors. When police arrived and began surrounding the building, establishing a perimeter and preparing tactical response teams to enter the facility, Thornton called 911 himself from inside the warehouse. In a chilling recorded conversation with the emergency dispatcher, Thornton claimed that he had been driven to violence by racial discrimination and that he had been subjected to racist treatment throughout his employment. He stated that he wished he could have killed more people and specifically mentioned that he had targeted white employees and managers in retaliation for the racism he alleged he had experienced. The dispatcher attempted to persuade Thornton to surrender peacefully, but he refused, indicating that he had no intention of being taken alive. As police tactical teams entered the building and began clearing rooms and searching for the gunman, Thornton retreated to an office area in the warehouse. Officers eventually located him, but before they could attempt negotiation or tactical intervention, Thornton turned one of his weapons on himself and committed suicide, ending the massacre that had lasted approximately 10 minutes from the first shots fired to his death. The investigation that followed was complicated by Thornton's allegations of racial discrimination, which his family and some community advocates insisted had been a genuine and severe problem at Hartford Distributors that management had failed to address properly. Company officials, co-workers, and union representatives vigorously denied that the workplace had been racist or that Thornton's complaints had been ignored, with many stating that they had never witnessed discriminatory behavior and that Thornton had been well-liked by most co-workers regardless of race. Investigators examined the facility for evidence of racist graffiti or other signs of discrimination, but found no corroborating physical evidence to support Thornton's claims. The company maintained that Thornton had been terminated solely for theft, which they insisted the surveillance video clearly documented. and that his allegations of racism were either fabricated or grossly exaggerated as a justification for his violent rampage. No criminal charges had ever been filed against any Hartford Distributors employees for racist behavior or harassment prior to the shooting. Mental health experts who reviewed the case noted that Thornton may have suffered from persecution delusions or may have genuinely experienced some level of workplace conflict that he interpreted through a racial lens and then catastrophized to justify extreme violence. The incident sparked difficult conversations in Connecticut and nationally about workplace discrimination, the importance of taking all harassment complaints seriously, the dangers of armed employees, and the devastating consequences when grievances, whether legitimate or perceived, escalate to mass violence. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against Hartford Distributors, arguing that the company should have had better security measures, should have anticipated that terminating Thornton could provoke violence given his complaints, and should have involved law enforcement in the termination meeting if they believed he had committed theft. The company eventually settled with the victims' families for undisclosed amounts. Manchester, a working-class community northeast of Hartford, was traumatized by the shooting, which remains one of the deadliest workplace massacres in Connecticut history. The Hartford Distributors facility was eventually closed permanently, the company unable to continue operations at a location so marked by tragedy. Thornton's mother and other family members maintained that racism had indeed been a serious problem at the company and that Omar had been driven to desperation, while the families of the victims struggled with the senselessness of losing their loved ones to workplace violence and rejected any justification for the massacre based on employment grievances, real or imagined. Number 8. Jing, the software engineer's violent rampage at Silicon Valley startup. Jing was a 47-year-old software engineer working at Xerox Corporation's research and technology facility in Webster, New York, a suburb of Rochester, when workplace tensions and personal grievances culminated in a deadly shooting on February 11, 2010. Wu had been employed at Xerox for several years, working on software development projects, but his relationships with colleagues had become increasingly strained, and he was reportedly involved in ongoing disputes with coworkers over work assignments, project contributions, and interpersonal conflicts that had created a toxic dynamic within his work group. On the morning of the shooting, Wu arrived at the Xerox facility armed with a handgun, having apparently decided that violence was his solution to workplace problems that had been building for an extended period. He entered the building and made his way to areas where his colleagues would be working, carrying out what appeared to be a targeted attack on specific individuals rather than random violence. Wu shot and killed Kathy DeBattiste, a 48-year-old employee who worked in human resources and had apparently been involved in workplace mediation efforts related to Wu's conflicts with other staff members. He then shot and killed David Lackner, a 50-year-old software engineer who had been Wu's colleague and with whom he had experienced significant professional disagreements and personality conflicts. The third victim was Randall Reed, a 49-year-old software engineer who was also part of the work group where tensions had been escalating. All three victims were shot at close range in what investigators determined was a deliberate, planned attack targeting people Wu blamed for his workplace dissatisfaction and career frustrations. After killing his three co-workers, Wu fled the Xerox facility in his vehicle as other employees discovered the bodies and called 911, triggering a massive law enforcement response. Police from multiple agencies, including Webster Police Department, Monroe County Sheriff's Office, and New York State Police, coordinated a manhunt for Wu, who was considered armed and extremely dangerous. Authorities issued alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout the region, distributed Wu's photograph and vehicle description, and warned the public to be vigilant. Approximately 1 hour after the shooting, police located Wu's vehicle traveling on a road in the neighboring town of Greece, New York. When officers attempted to conduct a traffic stop, Wu refused to pull over, leading to a brief pursuit. The chase ended when Wu pulled into a parking area near the Ontario Beach Park on the shore of Lake Ontario, exited his vehicle, and turned his handgun on himself, committing suicide before police could apprehend him. The investigation into the shooting revealed that Wu had been experiencing significant workplace stress and had been involved in multiple conflicts with coworkers that had been reported to management and human resources. Coworkers told investigators that Wu had difficulty accepting criticism, blamed others for project problems, and had exhibited concerning behavior that made some colleagues uncomfortable, though no one had anticipated that his frustrations would escalate to lethal violence. Human resources personnel had been working with Wu and his colleagues to mediate the workplace disputes and had implemented various interventions to try to reduce tensions. But these efforts had ultimately failed to prevent the tragedy. The fact that Wu targeted specific individuals, including a human resources employee who had been involved in workplace conflict resolution efforts, suggested that he had been planning the attack and had identified people he held responsible for his grievances. Xerox Corporation issued statements expressing devastation over the loss of 3 valued employees and offered counseling services to surviving workers who were traumatized by the violence. The Webster facility, which employed hundreds of workers conducting research and development for Xerox's technology products, implemented enhanced security measures following the shooting, including improved access control, threat assessment protocols, and training for managers on identifying warning signs of potential workplace violence. The families of the victims struggled to comprehend how workplace conflicts, which are common in many professional environments, could result in such catastrophic violence, and they filed wrongful death lawsuits against Xerox, alleging that the company had been aware of Wu's concerning behavior and conflicts with coworkers but had failed to take adequate steps to protect employees from the risk he posed. The cases were eventually settled confidentially. Mental health experts who analyzed the shooting noted that Wu exhibited characteristics common among workplace shooters, including a sense of persecution, externalization of blame for career frustrations, social isolation, and an inability to cope with workplace conflict through appropriate channels. The Webster community, typically quiet and known for its high quality of life in the Rochester suburbs, was shocked by the violence and mourned the loss of 3 residents who had been respected professionals contributing to technology development at a major corporation. The shooting added to a growing body of workplace violence incidents in the United States that have prompted employers across industries to develop more comprehensive threat assessment programs, violence prevention training, and protocols for managing employees who exhibit warning signs of potential violence. In the years since the shooting, workplace violence prevention experts have used the Xerox case as an example of how unresolved workplace conflicts, inadequate intervention by management and human resources, and an employee's inability to cope with perceived mistreatment can converge in deadly outcomes, emphasizing the importance of taking all workplace disputes seriously, providing mental health resources for struggling employees, and maintaining security measures that can respond to threats from current or former workers. Number 7. Radcliffe Haughton, the spa shooting after a restraining order. Radcliffe Haughton was a 45-year-old man from Brown Deer, Wisconsin, whose deteriorating marriage and escalating domestic violence had reached a critical point in October 2012 when his estranged wife, Azana Haughton, obtained a restraining order against him after years of abuse and controlling behavior. Azana worked at the Azana Salon and Spa in Brookfield, an upscale suburb of Milwaukee, where she was employed as an esthetician and had built relationships with colleagues and clients who knew her as a dedicated worker trying to escape a dangerous domestic situation. The restraining order, issued by a judge just days before the shooting, prohibited Radcliffe from having any contact with Azana and required him to surrender any firearms he possessed, standard provisions in domestic violence protective orders intended to reduce the risk of lethal violence. However, Radcliffe had no intention of complying with the order or accepting the end of his marriage. On October 21, 2012, just 4 days after the restraining order was issued, Radcliffe Haughton went to a gun shop and illegally purchased a handgun, circumventing the background check and waiting period requirements that should have prevented him from obtaining a weapon given the active restraining order against him. He acquired the firearm through a straw purchase, having someone else buy the gun on his behalf, a federal crime that demonstrated his premeditation and determination to arm himself despite legal prohibitions. That same day, he drove to the Azana Salon and Spa in Brookfield, arriving mid-morning when the facility was busy with clients and staff members providing hair styling, nail services, massages, and other spa treatments. Radcliffe entered the spa carrying the illegally obtained handgun and immediately began searching for his wife, moving through the salon areas with deadly intent while terrified clients and employees realized what was happening and tried to flee or hide. He opened fire in the spa, shooting multiple people in what became a chaotic scene of violence and terror. Radcliffe shot and killed his wife Azana, the primary target of his rage and the person whose decision to leave him and seek legal protection he could not accept. He also killed Carrie Roebuck, a 35-year-old spa employee who was shot while trying to help others escape or while caught in Radcliffe's rampage. The third victim was Malin Lind, a 38-year-old salon employee who was killed during the shooting. In addition to the 3 fatalities, Radcliffe shot and wounded 4 other people, including spa employees and clients who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, their lives forever altered by violence that had nothing to do with them personally but everything to do with one man's inability to accept rejection and his determination to maintain control over his wife even if it meant killing her. As police responded to 911 calls reporting an active shooter at the spa, arriving within minutes and surrounding the building, Radcliffe barricaded himself in a storage or utility area within the facility. Law enforcement established a perimeter, evacuated survivors, and began attempting to locate the gunman within the multi-room commercial space. Officers conducted a methodical clearing operation, moving carefully through treatment rooms, storage areas, and back corridors while ensuring that any remaining victims or staff members hiding in the building could be safely evacuated. After a tense standoff situation where police attempted to make contact with Radcliffe and negotiate his surrender, officers eventually located him in the area where he had retreated. He had taken his own life with the same gun he had used to murder his wife and 2 innocent salon employees, ending the massacre but leaving behind devastating trauma for survivors, families of the deceased, and the entire Brookfield community. The investigation revealed that Azana Haughton had been living in fear of her husband for years, confiding in friends and family about his abusive behavior, his refusal to accept her desire to end the marriage, and her belief that he might seriously harm her. She had taken the significant step of obtaining a restraining order, seeking help from the legal system to protect herself, but the order had proven ineffective in preventing Radcliffe from accessing a weapon and carrying out his planned attack. The case highlighted critical gaps in the implementation and enforcement of domestic violence protective orders, particularly regarding the removal of firearms from abusers and the monitoring of individuals subject to restraining orders. Wisconsin law at the time required individuals subject to domestic violence restraining orders to surrender firearms, but enforcement mechanisms were inconsistent, and there was no reliable system to ensure compliance or to prevent illegal gun purchases by those prohibited from possessing weapons. The straw purchase that allowed Radcliffe to obtain the murder weapon despite the restraining order exposed weaknesses in gun transaction regulations and the difficulty of preventing determined individuals from acquiring firearms illegally. Brookfield, an affluent and typically safe suburban community, was traumatized by the violence, and residents struggled with the reality that domestic violence, which many associated with other communities or socioeconomic groups, had manifested in deadly workplace violence in their own neighborhood. The Azana Salon and Spa never reopened, the business unable to continue operations at a location where 3 people had been murdered and where employees and clients had experienced such horrific trauma. The families of the victims, particularly the families of Carrie Roebuck and Malin Lind, who had no connection to the Haughtons' domestic dispute, filed lawsuits against various parties, including questions about whether the spa had adequate security measures and whether authorities had done enough to monitor Radcliffe after the restraining order was issued. Domestic violence prevention advocates used the Azana shooting as a case study in the dangers of domestic violence spilling over into public spaces and workplaces, emphasizing that intimate partner violence is not merely a private matter, but a public safety issue that can result in workplace massacres when victims seek safety by going to work while their abusers remain free and armed. Mental health and domestic violence experts noted that Radcliffe Haughton exhibited classic characteristics of abusive partners who cannot tolerate separation, including escalating violence when their partner attempts to leave, obsessive need for control, and a willingness to kill rather than accept the end of the relationship. The shooting led to legislative discussions in Wisconsin about strengthening domestic violence laws, improving systems for confiscating weapons from individuals subject to restraining orders, and providing better protection for victims of intimate partner violence, though the complex intersection of constitutional rights, enforcement resources, and individual liberties made comprehensive solutions elusive. Number 6. Nathan Gale, the heavy metal nightclub shooting of Dimebag Darrell. Nathan Gale was a 25-year-old former Marine suffering from severe mental illness, including paranoid schizophrenia with violent delusions focused on the heavy metal band Pantera and specifically on guitarist Darrell Abbott, known professionally as Dimebag Darrell. Gale had become obsessed with the belief that the members of Pantera had stolen songs from him, were monitoring his thoughts, or had somehow victimized him through their music, classic paranoid delusions that had no basis in reality but had become fixed beliefs in his deteriorating mental state. After Pantera disbanded in 2003, Dimebag Darrell and his brother, drummer Vinnie Paul Abbott, formed a new band called Damage Plan and began touring to promote their music and connect with the heavy metal community that had followed their careers for decades. On December 8, 2004, Damage Plan was performing at the Alrosa Villa, a small music venue and nightclub in Columbus, Ohio, as part of their touring schedule, playing to an audience of approximately 250 fans who had come to see the legendary guitarist perform. The venue had minimal security typical of small clubs on the local music circuit, with no metal detectors, limited security personnel, and easy access for patrons entering and exiting the facility. Nathan Gale, armed with a Beretta 92 9mm handgun, arrived at the venue shortly after the band began their set. He entered through a backstage area or side entrance, bypassing what little security was present, and made his way onto the stage while the band was performing, approaching from behind the amplifiers and equipment. Without warning, Gale shot Dimebag Darrell multiple times at close range, killing the guitarist instantly in front of the audience and his fellow band members. Gale continued firing, shooting Nathan Bray, a fan who had been standing near the stage and either tried to intervene or was simply in Gale's line of fire, killing him. He then shot and killed Aaron Halk, a venue employee working security that night who attempted to stop the gunman or protect others. The fourth person killed was Jeff Thompson, also known as Mayhem, who was a member of the band's road crew and was shot by Gale during the rampage. As chaos erupted in the venue, with concertgoers screaming, fleeing, and diving for cover, not understanding initially whether what they were witnessing was part of the show or actual violence, Gale took hostages, grabbing people and using them as shields while continuing to threaten others with his weapon. The situation became a hostage crisis as police responded to 911 calls reporting shots fired at the nightclub. Columbus Police Officer James Niggemeyer arrived on scene quickly as part of the initial response, entering the venue while other officers were still arriving and establishing a perimeter. Officer Niggemeyer made his way through the darkened club, moving toward the stage area where he could hear shouting and crying. When he reached a position where he could see the stage, Niggemeyer observed Gale holding a hostage at gunpoint, with victims already down and the situation clearly life-threatening for anyone remaining in the immediate area. Making a split-second tactical decision based on his training and assessment that waiting for SWAT or attempting negotiation would likely result in more deaths, Officer Niggemeyer aimed his 12-gauge shotgun and fired a single shot that struck Nathan Gale in the head, killing him instantly and ending the massacre approximately 5 minutes after it had begun. The hostage Gale had been holding was traumatized but physically unharmed. 2 other people had been wounded during the shooting but survived their injuries. The investigation revealed that Nathan Gale had a documented history of mental illness and had been discharged from the Marine Corps due to psychological issues. Friends and family members told investigators that Gale had been acting increasingly paranoid and had expressed bizarre beliefs about Pantera stealing from him or persecuting him in some way. He had become fixated on Dimebag Darrell specifically, apparently believing the guitarist was personally responsible for whatever grievances Gale had constructed in his delusional thinking. There was no evidence that Gale had ever had any actual contact with Pantera, Damage Plan, or any of the band members, and his beliefs about them were entirely products of his untreated mental illness. The shooting was not technically a workplace violence incident in the traditional sense, as Gale was not an employee of the venue or band, but it involved a workplace setting where employees and contractors were killed while performing their professional duties, and it highlighted the vulnerability of entertainment venues, bars, and nightclubs to active shooter incidents. The heavy metal community worldwide mourned the loss of Dimebag Darrell, who was widely regarded as one of the most talented and influential guitarists in metal music history and was known for his generosity toward fans and supportive attitude toward other musicians. His brother Vinnie Paul and the surviving members of Damage Plan were devastated by the attack and struggled with survivor guilt and trauma from witnessing their bandmate and brother murdered on stage. The Alrosa Villa continued operating as a music venue, though it would forever be associated with one of the most shocking acts of violence in the history of live music performance. Officer James Niggemeyer was praised for his decisive action and his marksmanship under extreme pressure, with many crediting him with preventing additional deaths by taking the shot that killed Gale when he did rather than allowing the situation to escalate further. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as yet another example of the tragic consequences of untreated severe mental illness and the need for better systems to identify and help individuals suffering from psychotic disorders before they become dangerous to themselves or others. The debate over gun access for individuals with documented mental health issues gained renewed attention after the shooting, though Gale had apparently obtained his weapon through private sale or other means that circumvented background checks that might have flagged his mental health history. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against the Alrosa Villa, alleging that the venue had inadequate security measures for a public entertainment space and should have had protocols in place to prevent armed individuals from accessing the stage area. The case was eventually settled. December 8th, the date of the shooting, already held tragic significance in music history as the anniversary of John Lennon's murder in 1980, and the coincidental date of Dimebag Darrell's death added another layer of sadness for music fans mourning the loss of another talented artist to senseless violence. The shooting led to increased security measures at many music venues, particularly smaller clubs that had traditionally operated with minimal security presence, including the addition of metal detectors, increased security staffing, restricted backstage access, and training for venue employees on active shooter response protocols. Number 5. Yvonne Hiller, the Kraft Foods factory shooting and bizarre behavior. Yvonne Hiller was a 43-year-old employee working at the Kraft Foods factory in Northeast Philadelphia, a large manufacturing facility that produced snack foods and employed hundreds of workers across multiple shifts. On September 9, 2010, Hiller's behavior during her evening shift became increasingly erratic and concerning to her coworkers and supervisors. She got into an argument with coworkers over work-related issues or personal conflicts, and the dispute escalated to the point where supervisors decided to suspend her from her shift and send her home. Being suspended or sent home from work is typically a temporary disciplinary measure that allows both the employee and management to cool down and reassess the situation, often followed by meetings with human resources to address whatever workplace conflict occurred. However, Yvonne Hiller did not accept the suspension calmly or leave the facility peacefully as expected. She initially left the factory floor after being told to go home, and supervisors believed the immediate situation had been resolved without further incident. What they did not know was that Hiller had gone to her vehicle in the employee parking lot, retrieved a .357 Magnum revolver that she had been keeping in her car, and was returning to the factory with lethal intentions. Hiller re-entered the Kraft Foods facility carrying the concealed handgun, moving through the manufacturing areas and corridors back to the section where she had been working and where her coworkers were continuing their shifts. She suddenly pulled out the revolver and opened fire on fellow employees, shooting multiple people in what appeared to be both targeted attacks on specific individuals involved in the earlier conflict and random violence against anyone in her vicinity. Hiller shot and killed 2 coworkers, both women who worked at the factory and had been on the same shift as her that evening. The victims were Tanya Renee Wilson, 47, and LaTanya Sharon Brown, 36, both Philadelphia residents who were working to support their families and had the misfortune of being present when Hiller returned with her weapon. In addition to the 2 fatalities, Hiller wounded a 3rd employee who survived but required hospitalization for gunshot injuries. The shooting created pandemonium in the factory, with workers fleeing in all directions, hiding behind industrial equipment and machinery, and trying to find exits while unsure whether the shooting had stopped or whether the gunman was still hunting for victims. The Kraft factory, with its complex layout of production lines, storage areas, and administrative offices, became a maze of terror as employees sought safety and police responded to reports of an active shooter at the facility. When Philadelphia police officers arrived and entered the factory, they began a systematic search for the shooter while also working to evacuate employees who were sheltering in place throughout the sprawling complex. Officers located Yvonne Hiller barricaded in a room or office area within the factory, armed with the revolver and refusing to surrender. A standoff situation developed, with police crisis negotiators attempting to establish communication with Hiller and persuade her to put down her weapon and come out peacefully. The negotiation process extended over several hours, during which time police maintained their perimeter, ensured that all other employees had been evacuated to safety, and prepared tactical options if negotiations failed. Eventually, through patient and skilled negotiation work by trained crisis intervention personnel, Hiller agreed to surrender. She put down her weapon and was taken into custody by police without further violence, allowing investigators to process the crime scene and begin piecing together what had motivated the deadly shooting. Yvonne Hiller was charged with 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, multiple counts of aggravated assault and weapons violations. She was held without bail as prosecutors prepared the case against her, collecting evidence from the crime scene, interviewing witnesses from the factory, and examining Hiller's background and mental state. During the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, defense attorneys raised questions about Hiller's mental health and whether she had been experiencing a psychological crisis at the time of the shooting. There were reports that Hiller had exhibited bizarre behavior before the shooting, including claims that she believed co-workers were talking about her, that she had made strange statements, and that her thinking had become increasingly paranoid or disordered. Mental health evaluations were conducted to assess her competency to stand trial and to determine whether she had been suffering from a mental illness that might affect her criminal culpability. Despite these mental health concerns, Hiller was found competent to stand trial, and prosecutors proceeded with first-degree murder charges, arguing that she had demonstrated clear premeditation by retrieving the gun from her vehicle and returning to the factory specifically to shoot her co-workers. The trial, which took place in Philadelphia's Court of Common Pleas, included testimony from surviving co-workers who witnessed the shooting, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and expert testimony about Hiller's mental state. In October 2012, a jury convicted Yvonne Hiller of 2 counts of third-degree murder, rather than the first-degree murder charges prosecutors had sought, apparently finding that while she had intentionally killed her co-workers, the circumstances did not meet the legal standard for first-degree premeditated murder. The jury also convicted her of attempted murder for shooting the third employee who survived, as well as aggravated assault charges. The judge sentenced Hiller to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never be released and could not pose a danger to the public again. The families of Tanya Wilson and LaTanya Brown mourned their losses, struggling with the senselessness of workplace violence that had claimed their loved ones over what appeared to be minor workplace conflicts or personality disputes that escalated catastrophically. Kraft Foods, a major international corporation, faced scrutiny over workplace safety and security measures at the Philadelphia factory. Though the company maintained that it had followed appropriate protocols in suspending Hiller and could not have reasonably anticipated that she would return armed and violent. The incident prompted discussions within the food manufacturing industry about security measures at large facilities, the screening of employees for weapons, the management of workplace conflicts, and protocols for ensuring that suspended or terminated employees cannot easily re-enter facilities. The fact that Hiller had been keeping a powerful handgun in her vehicle in the employee parking lot raised questions about whether employers should prohibit firearms on company property entirely. Though such policies face legal challenges in some jurisdictions where gun rights advocates argue that law-abiding citizens have a right to keep legal firearms in their vehicles. Mental health experts who analyzed the case noted that workplace shooters often exhibit warning signs before committing violence, including conflicts with coworkers, paranoid thinking, statements about being persecuted or treated unfairly, and difficulty managing anger or accepting discipline. The Kraft shooting added to the body of research on workplace violence prevention, emphasizing the importance of threat assessment, mental health support for employees, conflict resolution programs, and security measures that can respond quickly when violence erupts. Number 4, William Baker, the Nevada National Guard facility shooting. William Baker was a 34-year-old Nevada National Guard member who worked at the Nevada National Guard facility in Carson City, the state's capital, when personal and professional frustrations culminated in a shooting on the morning of October 6, 2015, that shattered the sense of safety typically associated with military installations. Baker arrived at the Nevada Army Guard facility where he was assigned, a complex that housed administrative offices, training areas, and support services for National Guard personnel. The facility, like most military installations, had security measures in place, but as Baker was an authorized service member with legitimate access to the base, he moved through checkpoints without raising immediate suspicion. What his fellow guardsmen did not know was that Baker was carrying weapons and harboring violent intentions driven by grievances related to his military career, personal relationships, or conflicts with other service members. At approximately 9 a.m., Baker opened fire inside the facility, targeting specific individuals in what appeared to be a planned attack rather than random violence. He shot and killed 4 people, all of whom were connected to the Nevada National Guard in various capacities. The victims included 2 Nevada National Guard officers who held leadership positions within the organization and were likely involved in decisions affecting Baker's military career or assignments. The other 2 victims were civilian employees or contractors working at the facility who may have had professional interactions with Baker or who were simply present when he carried out his rampage. The shooting created chaos within the military facility as personnel who had military training and experience reacted to the active shooter situation, some attempting to respond tactically while others sought cover or evacuated the building following emergency protocols. The response to the shooting involved both military police from the National Guard installation and local law enforcement from Carson City Police Department and the Carson City Sheriff's Office, who arrived rapidly after receiving reports of shots fired at the military facility. Law enforcement established a perimeter around the complex, working to secure the scene, evacuate personnel who were sheltering in place, and locate the shooter. As authorities closed in on Baker's location within the facility, he turned his weapon on himself and committed suicide, ending the massacre but leaving investigators to determine what had motivated the attack and whether warning signs had been missed. The investigation revealed that William Baker had been experiencing significant personal and professional difficulties in the period leading up to the shooting. He had been dealing with issues related to his military service, potentially including problems with his performance evaluations, conflicts with superior officers, or frustrations with his career progression within the National Guard. Some reports suggested that Baker may have been facing disciplinary action or had received unfavorable decisions regarding his military status, though the exact nature of his grievances was not fully disclosed in public statements from military officials. Baker's personal life was also reportedly troubled, with indications that he was experiencing relationship problems or other stressors outside of his military duties that may have contributed to his deteriorating mental state. The fact that Baker specifically targeted individuals with whom he had professional connections suggested that the shooting was not a random act of violence, but rather a calculated attack motivated by specific grievances or perceived wrongs. The Nevada National Guard and the broader military community were devastated by the shooting, which violated the expectation that military facilities, even those focused on administrative and support functions rather than combat operations, should be secure environments where service members can work without fear of violence from their fellow guardsmen. The murders raised difficult questions about threat assessment and violence prevention within military units, where service members are trained in weapons use and tactical operations but are also expected to maintain discipline, follow orders, and resolve conflicts through appropriate channels rather than violence. Military officials conducted a comprehensive review of the incident, examining Baker's service record, his interactions with command personnel and fellow guardsmen, and whether any warning signs of potential violence had been documented or reported but not acted upon effectively. The review sought to identify lessons learned and to improve protocols for identifying and intervening with service members who may be experiencing psychological crises, or who might pose risks to themselves or others. The families of the 4 victims mourned their losses and struggled with the reality that their loved ones had been killed not by foreign adversaries or during combat operations but by a fellow American service member at a domestic military facility. The shooting had ripples throughout the National Guard community in Nevada and nationally, as Guard members and military families confronted the uncomfortable reality that workplace violence could occur even within military institutions traditionally associated with honor, discipline, and camaraderie. Carson City, Nevada's capital and typically a quiet community of fewer than 60,000 residents, was shocked by the violence at the National Guard facility, one of the worst mass shootings in the city's history. The incident received significant media attention, though coverage was somewhat limited compared to civilian workplace shootings due to security concerns around military installations and the military's general preference for handling internal matters with discretion. Mental health and military experts who analyzed the case noted that service members face unique stressors, including the challenges of balancing civilian employment with military duties for National Guard members, the hierarchical structure of military organizations that can leave individuals feeling powerless or aggrieved, and the particular pressures faced by those who may be struggling with performance issues or facing administrative separation from service. The shooting highlighted the importance of mental health support for National Guard and Reserve members, who often lack the same level of access to mental health resources and command oversight that active duty service members receive. Following the shooting, The Nevada National Guard and the broader National Guard Bureau implemented enhanced training for leaders on recognizing signs of psychological distress in service members, improved access to mental health counseling and crisis intervention services, and updated threat assessment protocols to better identify individuals who might pose risks. The incident also prompted discussions about security measures at National Guard facilities, which typically have less robust security than active-duty military installations but house personnel and equipment that could be vulnerable to insider threats. The fact that Baker was able to bring weapons onto the facility and carry out the attack despite security checkpoints raised questions about whether additional screening measures, behavioral observation training for security personnel, or other preventive strategies might have detected his intentions before the shooting occurred. Number 3. Joseph Westbecker, the Standard Gravure Printing Press Massacre. Joseph Westbecker was a 47-year-old pressman who had worked for Standard Gravure, a printing company in Louisville, Kentucky, for over 15 years when his deteriorating mental health, workplace grievances, and easy access to firearms converged in one of the deadliest workplace shootings in American history. Westbecker had a long history of severe mental illness, including major depression and other psychiatric conditions that had worsened over time despite treatment with various medications, including Prozac, which had recently been prescribed to him and would later become the subject of controversy and litigation. He had been on long-term disability leave from Standard Gravure due to his psychological issues, but he remained consumed by anger and resentment toward the company, believing that management had treated him unfairly, that workplace conditions were intolerable, and that he had been wronged by supervisors and corporate policies. Westbecker's mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was stockpiling weapons and apparently planning a revenge attack on his former workplace. On the morning of September 14, 1989, Westbecker armed himself with an arsenal of weapons including an AK-47 assault rifle, a 9mm pistol, a .38 caliber revolver, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, loading the weapons and ammunition into a duffel bag and preparing for what would become a massacre. He drove to the Standard Gravure facility, a multi-story building in downtown Louisville where printing presses operated around the clock producing magazines, catalogs, and other printed materials for clients nationwide. Westbecker entered the building through an entrance he knew from his years working there, carrying his weapons in the duffel bag and moving through corridors toward the production floors where his former co-workers were operating the massive printing presses and bindery equipment. At approximately 8:30 a.m., as the day shift was in full operation, Westbecker pulled out the AK-47 and began firing indiscriminately at employees, moving methodically through different floors and departments of the facility. He shot workers at their stations, in hallways, on stairwells, and in break rooms, creating a scene of absolute carnage as employees scrambled for cover, fled toward exits, or hid behind equipment and furniture. Westbecker killed 8 people during his rampage. Sharon Needy, a 46-year-old employee, William Ganote, a 46-year-old pressman, James Francis' husband, a 47-year-old worker, Paul Sale Tate, a 44-year-old employee, John Stein, a 40-year-old pressman, Lloyd Dean White, a 42-year-old worker, Richard Barger, a 34-year-old employee, and James Weibel, a 42-year-old pressman. In addition to the 8 fatalities, Westbecker shot and wounded 12 other employees, inflicting injuries ranging from minor to permanently disabling. Some victims were shot multiple times, sustaining catastrophic wounds that required extensive surgeries and lengthy rehabilitation. The wounded survivors included people who would carry physical scars and psychological trauma for the rest of their lives, their sense of workplace safety shattered forever. As Westbecker moved through the building, police received multiple 911 calls from terrified employees, reporting the active shooter situation. Louisville Metro Police Department officers responded rapidly, surrounding the building and preparing to make entry while trying to account for the number of victims and the location of the shooter. The massive printing facility, with its multiple floors, industrial machinery, paper storage areas, and complex layout, presented significant challenges for law enforcement attempting to clear the building and locate the gunman. Before police could confront him, Westbecker made his way to a stairwell and turned one of his weapons on himself, committing suicide approximately 20 minutes after he had begun his rampage. Officers conducting the building search found his body along with the arsenal of weapons and spent shell casings that marked the trail of violence he had left through the facility. The aftermath of the Standard Gravure shooting was devastating for the Louisville community, the printing industry, and workplace safety advocates nationwide. The scale of casualties, the military-style weapons used, and the methodical nature of the attack shocked the nation and raised urgent questions about workplace violence prevention, mental health treatment, and gun access. The fact that Westbecker had been on disability leave for mental health issues yet had been able to amass an arsenal of firearms, including an assault rifle, sparked intense debate about background check laws and whether individuals with documented severe mental illness should be prohibited from purchasing weapons. The families of the victims and the wounded survivors filed lawsuits not only against Standard Gravure, alleging that the company had created hostile working conditions that contributed to Westbecker's rage and had failed to adequately respond to warnings about his mental state and potential for violence, but also against Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company that manufactured Prozac. The lawsuits against Eli Lilly claimed that the antidepressant medication had caused or exacerbated Westbecker's violent tendencies, contributed to suicidal and homicidal ideation, and that the company had not adequately warned about these potential side effects. The litigation became a landmark case in pharmaceutical liability, with Eli Lilly vigorously defending Prozac's safety profile and arguing that Westbecker's violence was the result of his underlying severe mental illness rather than the medication prescribed to treat it. After a lengthy trial that received national media attention and focused public scrutiny on antidepressant safety, the jury returned a verdict in favor of Eli Lilly, finding that Prozac had not caused Westbecker's violent actions. However, years later it was revealed that the verdict had been the result of a secret settlement agreement between the plaintiffs and Eli Lilly that had influenced how the case was presented to the jury, leading to controversy and allegations of manipulation of the judicial process. The verdict was eventually changed to dismissed with prejudice, rather than a defense victory. Standard Gravure continued operations after the shooting, though the company implemented significant security improvements and counseling services for traumatized employees who struggled to return to work at the site where so many colleagues had been murdered. The printing industry broadly began reassessing workplace security, recognizing that industrial facilities with multiple access points, shift work that brought employees in and out at various times, and cultures focused on production rather than security could be vulnerable to insider threats. Mental health professionals pointed to the Standard Gravure case as a devastating example of the consequences when severe mental illness goes inadequately treated and when warning signs of violence are not acted upon effectively. Coworkers and supervisors had reportedly been aware of Westbecker's mental health struggles, his anger toward the company, and his concerning statements, but the interventions available at the time were limited, and there was no effective mechanism to prevent someone with his psychiatric history from obtaining weapons. The shooting occurred just months after the Cleveland Elementary School shooting in Stockton, California, where a gunman using an AK-47 had killed 5 children, and the Standard Gravure massacre reinforced calls for assault weapons bans that would eventually lead to federal legislation in 1994. Louisville mourned the loss of 8 residents who had been working to support their families and contribute to a legitimate business, their lives cut short by workplace violence that seemed almost incomprehensible in its scale and brutality. The survivors who had been wounded or who had witnessed the massacre without being physically injured faced long-term psychological consequences, with many developing post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and an inability to feel safe in work environments. The case remains one of the deadliest workplace shootings in United States history and continues to be studied by threat assessment professionals, workplace violence prevention experts, and researchers examining the intersection of mental illness, employment conflict, and mass violence. Number 2, Matthew Beck, the Connecticut Lottery headquarters shooting. Matthew Beck was a 35-year-old accountant working at the Connecticut Lottery Corporation headquarters in Newington, Connecticut, a suburban community just outside of Hartford, when a dispute over his employment benefits and growing resentment toward his supervisors culminated in a planned workplace shooting on March 6, 1998, that killed 4 high-level executives and traumatized the organization. Beck had been employed by the Connecticut Lottery for several years, working in the accounting department where he handled financial records, processed transactions, and performed other duties related to the organization's fiscal operations. However, Beck had become increasingly dissatisfied with his employment situation, particularly regarding his compensation and benefits package. He believed that he was entitled to a higher salary level than what he was receiving and that he should be classified at a different pay grade that would increase his earnings and retirement benefits. When Beck raised these concerns with management and human resources, requesting reclassification of his position, his requests were denied after review by supervisors who determined that his current classification was appropriate for his duties and qualifications. This rejection infuriated Beck, who became convinced that he was being treated unfairly and that the lottery executives were deliberately denying him compensation he had earned and deserved. Over time, Beck's anger toward management festered and intensified, evolving from frustration with a pay dispute into a dangerous fixation on revenge against the specific individuals he held responsible for denying his requests. Beck began planning a violent attack on his workplace, acquiring weapons and apparently deciding that he would kill the executives who had rejected his compensation claims. On the morning of March 6, 1998, Beck arrived at the Connecticut Lottery headquarters building armed with a 9mm handgun, entering the facility where he had worked for years and where his presence would not immediately raise suspicion. He made his way to the executive offices on the building's upper floor, moving with purpose toward the specific individuals he had targeted. Beck methodically went from office to office, shooting 4 lottery executives at close range in what was clearly a planned assassination rather than a spontaneous outburst of workplace violence. The victims were Michael Logan, the lottery's president and CEO, who was shot in his office while working at his desk; Frederick Rubelman, the lottery's chief financial officer, who was killed in his nearby office; and 2 other senior executives, Otho Brown, who served as a vice president, and Timothy Choate, who held another high-level management position within the organization. All 4 men were shot multiple times and died either immediately or shortly after from their wounds, their murders occurring within minutes as Beck moved through the executive suite executing his revenge plan. The shootings took place during normal business hours when the lottery headquarters was fully staffed with dozens of employees working throughout the building. As gunshots rang out in the executive area, employees on other floors and in other departments initially did not understand what was happening, with some thinking they had heard construction noise or other innocuous sounds. Those working near the executive offices, however, quickly realized that something catastrophic was occurring and began evacuating the building or hiding in their offices behind locked doors. Someone called 911, and within minutes Newington Police and Connecticut State Police were responding to reports of an active shooter at the lottery headquarters. Officers arrived to find employees fleeing the building in panic, with many unable to provide clear information about how many victims there were or whether the shooter was still inside and active. Police established a perimeter around the building, began evacuating employees who were still inside, and prepared to make entry to search for the gunman and any additional victims. As tactical teams entered the building and began clearing rooms and floors, they found the bodies of the 4 executives in their offices, all shot at close range in what was obviously a targeted attack. Officers continued searching the building, moving cautiously through corridors and office spaces, until they discovered Matthew Beck's body in a different area of the facility. He had committed suicide with the same weapon he had used to murder his supervisors, shooting himself in the head and ending his life shortly after completing his planned executions. The investigation into the shooting revealed Beck's long-simmering anger over the pay classification dispute and his belief that he had been treated unjustly by lottery management. Investigators found evidence that Beck had been planning the attack for some time, having acquired the firearm specifically for this purpose and having apparently made mental preparations for carrying out the murders. Co-workers told investigators that Beck had been increasingly withdrawn and had made comments about his dissatisfaction with management, though no one had anticipated that his grievances would escalate to lethal violence. The fact that Beck had specifically targeted the 4 highest-ranking executives, all of whom had been involved in employment decisions affecting him or represented the management structure he resented, demonstrated the calculated nature of the attack. The Connecticut Lottery Corporation was devastated by the loss of its entire top leadership in a single violent incident, creating both organizational chaos and profound grief among surviving employees who had worked closely with the murdered executives. The state of Connecticut, which operated the lottery as a revenue-generating enterprise funding various state programs, faced the challenge of rebuilding lottery leadership while also addressing the trauma experienced by the organization's surviving employees and assessing what security measures might prevent similar incidents in the future. Governor John Rowland and other state officials expressed shock and sorrow over the murders, and flags were lowered to half-staff in honor of the victims. The Connecticut Lottery headquarters building became a crime scene, with state police forensics teams processing evidence and documenting the shooting locations. The lottery temporarily suspended operations while the investigation proceeded, and while officials determined how to resume business functions after such catastrophic losses. Mental health professionals were brought in to counsel traumatized employees who struggled with survivor guilt, fear of returning to work, and the psychological impact of knowing that a trusted coworker had systematically murdered the organization's leadership. The shooting raised important questions about workplace violence prevention in state government and quasi-governmental organizations like the Lottery Corporation. State officials examined whether there had been warning signs that Beck might become violent, whether his persistent complaints about his pay classification should have triggered more attention from human resources or employee assistance programs, and whether additional security measures at the lottery headquarters might have prevented the attack or reduced casualties. Some workplace violence experts noted that Beck's case illustrated a common pattern in workplace shootings where an employee becomes fixated on a perceived injustice, typically related to pay, promotion, or disciplinary action, and develops a grievance that grows disproportionately large in their mind until they convince themselves that violence is a justified response. The families of the 4 murdered executives filed wrongful death lawsuits against the state of Connecticut and the Lottery Corporation, alleging that officials had been aware of Beck's threatening behavior and complaints but had failed to take adequate protective measures or to recognize the risk he posed. The cases were eventually settled for significant amounts paid by the state. The Connecticut Lottery Corporation implemented comprehensive security improvements after the shooting, including controlled access systems, security personnel, threat assessment protocols, and training for managers on recognizing warning signs of potential workplace violence. The organization also developed more robust employee assistance and conflict resolution programs aimed at addressing workplace disputes before they escalated to dangerous levels. Newington, a quiet suburban town that had never experienced such violence, mourned the victims and struggled with the reality that workplace violence had struck a state government facility in their community. The shooting remains one of the most significant workplace violence incidents involving state government employees in American history and continues to be studied by security professionals and human resources experts as a case study in the deadly consequences of unresolved employment disputes and inadequate threat assessment. The victims' families established memorial scholarships and funds in honor of the murdered executives, seeking to create something positive from the tragedy while never forgetting that 4 accomplished professionals had been murdered by a disgruntled coworker over what had begun as a disagreement about job classification and pay. Number 1. Nasim Aghdam, the YouTube headquarters shooting. Nasim Aghdam was a 38-year-old woman from San Diego, California, who had become obsessively focused on YouTube and her belief that the video platform was suppressing her content, restricting her channel's growth, and unfairly limiting her ability to earn money from her videos, grievances that would ultimately lead her to drive to YouTube's headquarters in San Bruno, California, on April 3, 2018, and open fire on employees in one of the most unusual workplace violence incidents in Silicon Valley history. Aghdam had been creating and uploading videos to YouTube for several years, producing content that ranged from animal rights activism to fitness tutorials to bizarre performance art pieces that garnered limited viewership and engagement. She became convinced that YouTube was deliberately suppressing her videos through its algorithm, demonetizing her content so she could not earn advertising revenue, and engaging in censorship against her specifically, beliefs that reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how YouTube's content recommendation and monetization systems work, but that had become fixed obsessions in her mind. Aghdam frequently complained on social media and in videos about YouTube's alleged persecution of her, claiming that her view counts had been artificially reduced, that her videos were being hidden from potential viewers, and that the company was discriminating against her in ways that violated her rights. Her family members were aware of her fixation on YouTube and her increasingly agitated mental state regarding the platform, and they had reported concerns to law enforcement that she might be planning to do something dangerous. In the days before the shooting, Aghdam had driven from San Diego to the San Francisco Bay Area, apparently with the intention of confronting YouTube at its corporate headquarters. Her family reported her missing to police when she did not return home, and law enforcement eventually located her sleeping in her vehicle in a parking lot in Mountain View, California, not far from YouTube's headquarters. Officers spoke with her briefly to check on her welfare, but she did not make any specific threats or exhibit behavior that would have justified detaining her under mental health provisions, so she was allowed to leave after the welfare check. What police did not know was that Aghdam was carrying a 9mm handgun and was planning to attack YouTube's headquarters as revenge for what she believed the company had done to her online presence and livelihood. On April 3, 2018, Agdam arrived at YouTube's headquarters campus in San Bruno, a sprawling corporate complex that housed thousands of employees working on the video platform, its technical infrastructure, content moderation, advertising sales, and corporate functions. YouTube headquarters, like many Silicon Valley technology company campuses, had a relatively open design with outdoor areas, courtyards, and buildings where employees could move freely, reflecting the tech industry's culture of openness and collaboration but also creating security vulnerabilities. Agdam approached the campus and entered outdoor areas where YouTube employees were eating lunch, taking breaks, or moving between buildings during the midday period. At approximately 12:46 p.m., she pulled out her handgun and began firing at people on the outdoor patio and courtyard areas, shooting at employees who were eating at tables, walking across the campus, or standing in groups talking. The gunfire created immediate chaos as people dove for cover, ran toward buildings, or attempted to help wounded colleagues while others pulled out phones to call 911 or live stream the unfolding attack. Agdam shot and wounded 3 people during her rampage before police arrived on scene. The wounded victims included a 36-year-old man who was shot in the leg, a 32-year-old woman who sustained abdominal wounds that required surgery, and a 27-year-old woman who was shot and seriously injured. All 3 victims survived their injuries but faced lengthy recovery processes and psychological trauma from the attack. Several other people sustained minor injuries while fleeing the scene, including a twisted ankle and scrapes from falling while running. San Bruno Police Department officers, along with officers from neighboring jurisdictions who responded to mutual aid requests, arrived at the YouTube campus within minutes of the first 911 calls. As officers approached the area where the shooting had occurred, searching for the active shooter and working to secure the massive campus with its multiple buildings and outdoor spaces, Agdam moved to a different location away from the initial shooting site. Before police could locate and confront her, she turned the gun on herself and committed suicide, shooting herself in the chest and ending the attack approximately 3 to 4 minutes after it had begun. Officers found her body and secured the weapon, then continued clearing the campus to ensure there were no additional threats and to account for all employees and visitors. The YouTube headquarters campus was locked down, with employees sheltering in place inside buildings, while police conducted their search and investigation. Many employees had live-streamed or posted about the shooting on social media as it unfolded, creating a strange meta-narrative where an attack on the world's largest video platform was being documented in real time by the platform's own employees using the very technology they had built. The shooting shocked Silicon Valley, an area more associated with technological innovation and startup culture than workplace violence, and raised questions about security at technology company campuses that had traditionally operated with minimal security presence and open designs intended to foster creativity and collaboration. YouTube's parent company, Google, which had acquired YouTube years earlier and operated it as a subsidiary, released statements expressing devastation over the attack and pledging support for the wounded employees and their families. The company brought in trauma counselors and mental health professionals to help employees process the violence and provided security escorts for workers who were afraid to return to the campus. The investigation into Agdam's background and motives revealed the extent of her obsession with YouTube and her belief that the company was persecuting her. Investigators reviewed her social media posts, her YouTube videos, and communications where she had expressed anger at the platform and had accused it of censorship and discrimination. Her family confirmed to investigators that they had been worried about her mental state and her fixation on YouTube, and they expressed anguish that their attempts to alert authorities had not prevented the tragedy. The fact that police had encountered Agdam during a welfare check just hours before the shooting raised difficult questions about what officers could or should have done differently, though legal experts noted that without specific threats or behavior meeting criteria for emergency mental health detention, police had limited authority to intervene. The YouTube shooting was unusual among workplace violence incidents in several respects. The shooter was female, whereas the vast majority of workplace and mass shooters are male. She targeted a company not because she was a disgruntled employee, but because she was a disgruntled content creator who felt victimized by the platform's policies. And she attacked a technology company that millions of people use daily, bringing workplace violence into a setting that had seemed immune to such violence. The incident prompted technology companies throughout Silicon Valley to reassess their security measures, with many implementing more stringent access controls, increased security personnel, and protocols for managing threats from users, customers, or others outside the company who might develop grievances. YouTube itself faced criticism from some content creators who argued that the platform's opaque algorithms, changing monetization policies, and perceived inconsistencies in content moderation created frustrations that, while not justifying violence, reflected real problems with how the company communicated with and supported its creator community. The company announced various initiatives to improve creator support and transparency, though the fundamental challenges of operating a platform with billions of users and millions of creators remained complex. The 3 wounded employees recovered from their physical injuries over time, though all dealt with lasting psychological effects of having been shot and having witnessed the attack. San Bruno, a small city located between San Francisco and Silicon Valley, had its sense of community security shattered by the violence at one of its major employers. YouTube headquarters continued operations after the shooting, with enhanced security measures including vehicle barriers, controlled access points, security guards, and protocols for responding to threats from individuals fixated on the company or its employees. Mental health and threat assessment experts who analyzed the case noted that Agdam exhibited several warning signs that have been identified in research on attackers who target institutions or companies, including a sense of persecution, externalization of blame for personal or professional failures, online documentation of grievances, and a willingness to sacrifice her own life to carry out revenge. The shooting highlighted the challenges that large platforms like YouTube face in managing relationships with millions of content creators, some of whom may develop unrealistic expectations about success, may blame the platform for their lack of viewership or revenue, and may in rare cases develop dangerous fixations that turn violent. The case remains a unique example of workplace violence where the perpetrator was not an employee, customer, or business partner in the traditional sense, but rather a user of a digital platform who felt aggrieved by the company's policies and algorithms, illustrating how modern technology companies face threat landscapes that differ from traditional workplace violence scenarios.